GM friends, and welcome to the Metacast Crypto Corner brought to you by Naavik. I'm your host, Nico Vereecke, and today I'm joined by Timshel, Threepwave, and Lord of a Few, who is also known as Loaf. And as you might be able to guess from these names, or if you're watching this on YouTube from our cameras or non-existent cameras, our discussion today will be focused on the more Web3 native side of games. If you might remember an episode we did a few months ago about loot. And so today it's been a bit more than 1 year since loot was created. And I thought it was a great opportunity to get these builders back on the show to discuss the current state of loot, where we're at, how things have evolved, lessons learned, how we're excited for the future, and, you know, if people are excited, how they can help and contribute to this growing ecosystem universe that is the Lootverse. I've had some compliments about, you know, how well things were explained last time, and specifically by Timshel, who's also here. He's one of the driving forces in the whole loot ecosystem. So Tim, why don't you bring us back a bit and talk about, you know, the initial vision for loot and a bit about everything that's happened over the past year.
Right on, GM, everybody. Loot year 2. Cannot believe this has been a year of Threep and Loaf and Loot Hero and the rest of this crew working together on this crazy adventure. But yeah, today I think we're going to unpack a lot of it. But so Loot year 2, before we dive into year 2 and the road ahead, and I think what we've learned and the seeds that have been planted that we're thinking about for this future, fair to go backwards a little bit. I don't think we want to spend too much time on where loot came from, but let's spend a little bit here. So top line, I'd frame the sort of the conversation here as the evolution from loot to the Lootverse. So loot itself is an NFT project launched by Dom Hoffman. Out of nowhere, this magnetic pulse in the universe, a lighthouse for builders, this pull sort of across the ecosystem of builders and creators and geeks and others saying, hey, what is this thing? I feel like I need to participate in this. And bam, out of loot was born the Lootverse. And what the Lootverse is this interconnected, sort of infinitely expansive, but still like loosely, slightly cohesive fantasy universe that we're building together. It's a game world. It's a media project in terms of multimedia, hypermedia, different forms of media, stories, art, etc. It's a foundation for a bunch of utilities that have been built and a bunch of open source code that's been deployed into the world for, you know, all sorts of reasons. And it's been, you know, this is a word that's overused for sure, but at the core, it's been a community in that Loot has brought people together. I think the Discord has like 90,000 people inside of it now, and I think 90,000 probably is a big overestimate since Discord sometimes can get so crazy. But it's definitely thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands if you think about the holders of all the Lootverse items, who've come together and said, hey, we see something here, and we're not exactly sure what it is, but it feels special, and it feels important, and it feels fun, and it feels intriguing, and it feels magnetic to us. And so what this conversation today is going to be about is almost less so about loot and more about this infinitely expansive game world, media world, decentralized universe that we're building together between Biblioteca, which is Loaf's brainchild, and this game ecosystem between Crypts and Caverns, which Threep is going to talk about today, between stuff I've been working on, Genesis Project and the Eye, OpenQuill, between Loot Explorers and Hyperloot and Portals and Passages and yada, 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 the Crypt. There's a bunch of projects that sort of collectively make up this thing we call the Lootverse. And so I'll end that little intro about what loot is by saying, if loot year 1 was about establishing this magnetic foundation and presenting us in some ways with a time machine to like what the future of collaborative work could be, loot year 1 was like establishing a rich foundation and starting to build the architecture on top of it, loot year 2 is about building a sustainable system on top of that foundation. And Loot Year 2, and maybe that's through Year 10 or through Year whatever, to me is going to be defined by how it can build a infinitely expansive and still cohesive ecosystem, but in a sustainable way, where it's not just a quiet foundation that's quietly allowing people to show up and raise their hand and say, hey, this is interesting. What is this place? But also can play a more active role in building this virtuous cycle of self-reinforcing value creation. That sounds like a ridiculous mouthful that I just threw out there. But what I mean by that is that when we as builders, when Realms improves its game foundation, when Crypts and Caverns in the community starts to come up with some sort of new lore or feature, when writers in the Loot community publish new content and create new characters, like when all of this activity happens, instead of happening in parallel silos, where each project is just like one branch or one sprout coming out of the ground, these projects can really influence each other, and they can provide value to each other, where a character can cross between projects, where a user's player can pop up in multiple parts of this universe, where things you learn in one side get applied to the other side, both sort of conceptually as a user, but also technically. And so I'm sure we're going to get into some of that today. Again, really driven by Bibliotheca DAO as an anchor force behind the Lootverse. We've just, I think, arrived at the next chapter of Loot in terms of the advancement of that foundation and the beginnings of building that sustainable system on top of it. That's all very meta, but Threep and Loaf, please dive in, add on to that.
Sure. I think it was interesting that you said that the Bibliotheca is the force. I think that Loaf, the force of will that is Loaf, is actually the force that is keeping that the gravity in the gravity well, pulling everyone into this universe at the moment. But you'll hear from him in a minute. My name is Threepwave. My background is in virtual reality and virtual worlds. I work on a project called Crypts and Caverns, and Crypts and Caverns is a set of on-chain dungeon maps. Tim covered what Loot is, why it's special, etc. I thought it might be helpful for me to touch on why, in reflection after a year, I believe in the ethos of Loot. And to me, what Loot did that was very special was two things. It wasn't that it created a bunch of items on the internet. To me, that's interesting. But I feel like the first thing it did that was special is it gave us constraints. And it made us feel like we can build. If you look at the creative process, it's very, very difficult for any artist or creator or programmer or anyone creating something in the world to put what is in their heart and put that out in the world. It's a very difficult process. And one of the hardest things is that you can create anything. And I think Loot, for me at least, gave me a constraint. And that constraint was black text, white words, very simple, modular, composable items. And when I saw that within an RPG universe, we are adventurers, we are going on adventures, that gave me just enough of a boundary to figure out where I fit into that box and say, okay, I can do something here. And so that to me was one really powerful thing that happened a year ago. Number two was that the ethos behind Loot was not, as was mentioned at the beginning by Nico, a single vision holder saying this is what we should do. And as much as sometimes in the very beginning I wanted Dom to say, Dom, just tell us what it should be and what it's going to be, it's actually very powerful for us to come together and define what this thing can be as a group. We all are empowered collectively to figure out what the future of Loot looks like. And that's very different than most games you see today. And those two things have taken me from thinking, okay, I'm going to build an on-chain set of maps, to now thinking about things like, what if every item wasn't just composable and could be plugged in together? What if contracts were composable? What if any builder and developer out there could come together and build systems for a bigger game and make this thing bigger than it already is? And so that's what excites me about Loot still today, what excited me from the beginning. The main thing that's changed for me, I have a little bit more time these days, and I feel like we're starting to get real games and experiences and lore out there in the world. And we're not just talking about it, and now we're doing it.
Yeah, ditto to what Tim and Threep just said. I share the same sentiment about Loot, and sorry, GM. Well, I'm Loaf. I'm one of the core devs at Bibliotheca DAO, and we've been building our on-chain game for almost a year now. And just following on from what Threep said about the constraints, and what sniped me mostly about Loot was it's not just the constraints of Loot that sniped me. That I found that very interesting. This like open source world build, and you can build whatever you want on it. It's this creative canvas you can go crazy on. I've always been fascinated with just this idea of running entire complex applications on like a shared substrate, which is the blockchain. And so from the very beginning, myself and Redbeard, when we kind of first got stuck into Loot, we were like, well, we want to build a game that pulls these Loot items together, but we want to run it all on chain. And so for the last year, we've been figuring out how to do that. And so we originally started running this game on Arbitrum, but we ran into some constraints. So we kind of, I think we made a proposal back in October, that was a long time ago, about bringing the whole Lootverse to Starknet, because we thought it was, we think it is going to be the most expressive blockchain for on-chain games. And so really what we've been trying to do for the last year, it's definitely been an insane year, is try to figure out how to build immersive and scalable on-chain games. And so Threep's, we're all actually, Tim and Threep are part of the DAO, and we're all building this world, and we are getting quite close to fun functioning games. But it's been a challenge, and it's still early in this cycle. So,
Loaf, let me jump in on that if I can. Sorry, Nico. I love the way you just phrased that at the end there, that you said Threep and Timshel are part of the DAO. I kind of love that, and I want to use that as an opportunity just to say, for people who are listening to this who are maybe like Web3 curious or Web3 skeptical or something, when we say that, what we mean is that the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, big words, is open, and that anybody who's intrigued by this, and anybody who wants to participate in this, and anybody who's curious to learn more or be part of this in any capacity, is welcome to join. Now, not all DAOs are permissionless, meaning like some DAOs you have to do a whole application process and apply to be part of it. And what's unique and interesting about Loot and the Lootverse and Biblioteca DAO is that it is more of a permissionless foundation. When Threep was talking about the ethos of Loot, I think that really fits the ethos of Loot, sort of that thou mayest join, thou mayest build, everybody is welcome energy. And so if you're listening to this and curious, you can join the DAO too. You can jump into the Discord. That's where most of the action happens for the Lootverse, either the Loot Discord or the Biblioteca Discord. And just start to follow along, ask questions. Like, everybody is present. What's ridiculous sometimes about this world is it's so 24/7. So if even while you're listening to this on YouTube or wherever you're listening to this, you say, "Oh, I'm curious," find the Discord, open it up. Even while you're still listening, ask a question, and I'll almost guarantee that somebody in real life live will genuinely and thoughtfully reply back to you. This is a whole new model for how teamwork works and collaboration works. And it's messy and crazy and frustrating and hair-wrenching and whatever other words you want to put at times. But it's also beautiful and joyful and really effective if you can harness it well. Loaf and Threep and I didn't know each other before this. Loot brought us together. And people joke like, oh, community and internet friends and whatever, but there's a lot of truth to it. I'm sure you can hear it in our voices as we talk. But there's a real sense of belonging that the Lootverse creates, and there's a real sense of sort of magnetic energy and vision and sort of a collective dream that's being built together. So my headline on that point is, if you're interested, when Loaf says DAO, what he also means is, that's an invitation. Come join us.
And if you're a developer or a storyteller, there's always something to do, and there's all the code's open source. So, you don't even have to talk to us. You can just go and see an issue on GitHub and tackle it. And just a note on that, all the core developers in Bibliotheca DAO, before they became core developers, they actually contributed to the some of the open source code, which is a beautiful thing. And then they became core developers. So there's a lot to build.
Sorry, I must just keep saying one more thing here. I realize we are talking in crazy crypto Web3 language sometimes, and so maybe just one more comment about what it is that we're building through all of this. If you don't really know much, or again are skeptical about this world, imagine if Lord of the Rings, or say, I don't know, Harry Potter, if you want to go that direction, or Game of Thrones, maybe if you go the other direction. Imagine if those, instead of being owned by just one corporation who hires a bunch of writers and owns all the IP and puts out movies and books and games and stories and art and whatever else around it, enables some fan fiction, but mostly says, hey, this is our property. Imagine the richness of that world and the kind of fractal expansion of that world was in the hands of the public domain, and that anybody could collectively come in and say, I'm going to build a game, I'm going to write a story, I'm going to make a movie, I'm going to make music, I'm going to make art, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to work together with other people to weave my character from my story into somebody else's game. I'm going to build a utility for this thing. And that you didn't have to call up HBO or Electronic Arts or whoever and ask permission, but you could just join. That's what Loot is. It's a decentralized fantasy franchise, if you will, collectively owned and created by the community.
Got it. I'm going to sometimes play a bit of the advocate of the devil here and tell you guys that you're too meta for this, and sometimes push back. I'm curious. So Loot started as a primitive, as assets, as Threep described, a black background, white text, 8 items that together form equipment for an adventure. I see that as a primitive. And what has been built on top of that are other primitives that form the foundation of this whole world. Could you give me some tangible examples of some of the primitives that have been built, that are being built, that will, help this whole space move forward? Loaf, you want to give some suggestions, and then perhaps Threep and Tim can also join in?
Yeah. Loot was really, it was the lore layer and the data layer, and from the original contract. But I'll explain kind of how we've interpreted it and what we're doing. And so, every derivative is kind of spawned from Loot. There's some that I guess are more canonical and some that are not. But I guess the thing is, you don't have to be canonical. You can go in any direction you want. We've tried to stay true to the contract and treat the contract as, as canon. And but the reality is that Loot being on mainnet, you can't really do that much with it from a kind of a game perspective. And so we're kind of migrating it all to Starknet, which will allow it to be used in a much more, I guess, dynamic fashion. And so we're splitting up all the Loot items into the individual bits, and we're also creating on-chain characters, which will allow you to equip the Loot items. But everything that we do with that, we're treating it from like a composability point of view, where everything will interop with one another and everything will still be permissionless. So we've just taken the Loot contract and we split it into its 8 bits, and we've created a couple other contracts. And now with those more, I guess, usable contracts that are on Starknet, which are a much cheaper environment to do things, developers can come along and build on top of that. And so that's the approach that we're taking with some of these other primitives.
So these are gaming-oriented, mostly primitives, right?
Exactly, yeah. So, Bibliotheca DAO, we're focused on building on-chain games. That's kind of our core vision, is to build the Lootverse, to build the game for the Lootverse on Starknet. So everything we do, it revolves around that. And the Loot items that we've created are, the Loot items, they have their own statistics. and whatnot, and you can take them and you can incorporate them into any game that you build on StarkNet. So I guess it's creating. We've created more composable version of the loot bags, but still true to the original contract.
Got it. And so, just for the listeners that haven't followed, because we've talked about StarkNet a bunch. Essentially, StarkNet is a layer 2 scaling solution that makes transactions way cheaper, which makes it that we can actually do way more stuff on chain. We don't have to be too careful for too many interactions that can get expensive. Okay, got it. Loaf, while we're at it, could you talk about more practically what game you're building? Because I can imagine some of the game developers that are listening to this being like, what the hell, on-chain games? How does that work? What does this look like? I have no idea. Could you go a bit more into that?
Well, it's funny. That question, like, what does it look like? Threep and I have been trying to answer that for a while now, and I don't think anybody really has the answer to, what does an on-chain game look like? It's kind of analogous to, the early consoles like the SNES and whatnot. Because back then, when you were designing a game for the SNES, you had this like fixed constraint of the hardware, and so that was all you could do. You had to squeeze everything you could out of these out of that tiny bit of hardware. So the developers came up with very interesting games that revolved around that constraint, and that's what created the fun, was the constraint. And so it was a new medium you had to design for. And so it's kind of similar to what we're trying to do with this new medium, which is the blockchain. And on this new medium, there's some quirky parts to it, meaning all the information's open. It's all running on this public chain. There's a little bit of latency because, everybody's writing their information to the chain. There's no central server changing the information like in a traditional, networked game. And so that's kind of and I think in this cycle of on-chain games, it's still so early. And there are I think there's about to be an explosion of on-chain games, and now that the technology kind of is capable of handling it. But it's still very early, and it's still kind of this weird and wonderful stage where everyone's trying to figure out what an on-chain game is and trying to figure out what's a fun mechanic with these constraints and whatnot. And so that's exactly what we're trying to figure out. And the game, like the core game that we're building, revolves around loot realms, and loot realms were one of the first loot derivatives, which are 8,000 generative maps, and they have resources and they have specific traits on them. And so in this first game that which we've been building, we've been really building the tech stack to enable not just this game, but like all the other games that we produce in the future. But the first game is really revolves around these 8,000 realms, and they're all situated on this gigantic map with X, Y, and coordinates. And if you have a realm, you can settle your realm and you can start generating resources. And once you've generated those resources, you can build up your realm. You can build barracks and castles, and then with those buildings, you can build armies. And then with those armies, you can go and travel to other places in the realmverse, and fight wars and steal resources from other realms. And so that's kind of like the core meta of that of the first release. And all that logic and all that state exists on chain. And so we just have our visual client, which we're going to make look good, but really it's just an interpretation of the information that's on chain. And so that's kind of cool. That's like the first game that we're building, and it's just kind of laying the foundation for this ever expanding lootverse. And like Threep's project, Crypts and Caverns, is going to be in the next release, and we're porting them to StarkNet, and they're going to be generative dungeons, and we have to do some fun things with that. But it's really like it's as Tim has been talking about, like this is an invitation to any developer that wants to come and build. You can take our primitives that we've designed and copy our code. And we've done all the hard yards trying to design this tech stack, and so you can take that and build on top and build into this world as you wish.
Loaf, I think it would be really cool if you could take us from, because I've been on this journey with you, but not everyone has. Like, get really tactical, like if you think about the game itself, like how did the Realms game start? What was the initial idea? And then what did you iterate? And like you're in the process of like finding the fun and going from like, okay, you found something that's fun. Can you talk us through like where did you start? And then like what did you find that was fun? Like what's changed throughout the development process and where are you now in terms of like game mechanics and how you play the game?
Yeah, I would definitely still, trying to answer that question. What is the fun? I think, in games, it's about agency and about choice. And so it's like, I have a realm. What can I do with it? And then from a developer point of view, it's like, well, how do we give players choice in this whole new constraint? And so that's like the original game didn't have any travel. It didn't have any coordinates. And we quickly realized it doesn't give the player enough agency to move around. And it's all about choice, really, in any game. It's like, do I do this? Do I do that? And so that's what we're really, really leaning into is trying to give as much agency as possible to the players. And it's all like this game that we will release it will last for the length of Ethereum, really. It's all running on this public chain. Nothing's going to take it down. So once production's live, it will just continue to exist, and empires will rise and fall within it. But the game will always go on. So yeah, it's definitely an iterative process in trying to figure out the fun. But that's like designing any game. You start with your original thesis and you just keep evolving it from there.
Super exciting. And one of the things I want to do is get on a one-on-one with you, Loaf, and just talk about a deep dive into Realms and what exactly you're building and how it works. I'm curious to also get an idea of why people get involved in the Lootverse. So the way you're speaking, it's as if everyone's just like really excited about this and just wants to help and do something. But unfortunately, we live in a world where we have to pay rent and pay for food. How does that work, Loaf? You've built a team of people that are helping you. Could you tell us like practically how it works? You're like a very decentralized organization. You probably don't even know the first names of a lot of people you work with. So like, how are people getting rewarded for this? Why, like if anyone wants to like, is really inspired here and wants to quit their job, like how will they still be able to put food on the table?
Yeah, I think it's definitely early in that sense. And just to recap, I've built businesses in the real world, and when I started this project, I just told myself like, let's just do this organization totally Web3, for better or worse. And so that has come with its challenges. But we do have our core contributors are paid directly in ETH. We don't have we're not domiciled in any country. It's a totally decentralized group of people. And yes, I don't know the first name of anybody on the team really, but that's fine because all that really matters is what you do. And so if you turn up and you push code, that's all that matters in this world. It doesn't matter if you're from. I think we have people from Brazil, America, Europe, and Asia. So we're hitting everywhere in the world. Who's part of the DAO and part of the core team now, which is amazing. And like you couldn't do that in the in the old world and give everyone skin in the game. That's what I love about this whole new really Ethereum economy, which is really what it is. It's this whole digital economy that we're all living in. We just don't quite grok that yet. So and for people that are coming into this space, I definitely wouldn't advise quitting a job and just trying to join a DAO. That's probably not the best move. Probably the best move is if you're a developer specifically, try to find a DAO with open source code and tackle some issues. Like we have a bunch of issues on. We have like 5 repos going, like GitHub repositories going at any time, and they all have issues within them. And anyone can come and actually tackle them. And often, like me personally, if people contribute to open source code, and that's all that really matters. Is like if people can see the quality of your code, then you'll get hired. And if you're a talented developer in front end or back end or contracts, that's the best place to start. Just contribute to an open source project in part of your free time, and you never know what will come from that.
I think we also see a few other archetypes of people that show up. Like I think you're talking about the kind of like devs or dev curious group. There's also I think there's a lot of lurkers who are just interested and curious, as Timshel said, to see where this crazy experiment goes. I think that's actually a big group of people. There's also speculators. There's people who maybe bought some loot. Maybe they bought some NFTs along the way. They have maybe a realm. They've got a few lords, and they're curious to see, like, what does this become? Some people might think they've got the next gold mine. Some people might just want to be along for the ride and see, like, what happens to all these weird in-game assets? Do they ever become worth anything? And I think there's another class of people who are almost like game dev curious. Or world building curious. And so you see some people, I'll just use the Crypts and Caverns Discord, for example. There are people who like to write lore about their dungeons. And like Loot, the Crypts and Caverns dungeons, to those who haven't seen them, they are purposely very simple. They're very simple maps. They have doors and walls and floors and these things we call points of interest. And they have some color schemes we call biomes. But people have written, short stories about their dungeons. They've taken their dungeon and woven it together with their realm to create a bigger story where there's a mage attacking other people in their realm. They've taken Genesis Adventures, which is another project that Timshel created within Loot, and they've wrote the story of their Genesis adventure. You have other people who create art. There's an artist who just creates icons and who has done a bunch of 3D work in Bibliotheca DAO. And so I do think you have people who are just excited to be around a game that they can actually contribute to and where their ideas are welcome, which often doesn't happen in the rest of the game dev world, whether it be a commercial game or an open source game. And so those are some of the different archetypes that I've seen that are kind of just interested in and rotating around this sphere.
I'd like to jump in on that one too. Nico, you asked a good question. You asked sort of almost a brass tacks question, like, hey, this is an incredible, fantastical universe y'all are building, but how about brass tacks? Like, how does somebody get incentivized to work inside of this? And so plus one to what Loaf and Threep just said, but I'll ask or answer with another brass tacks comment here, which is that people are being rewarded for their contributions, either rewarded through, I guess, three ways, either rewarded through participating in a team like Bibliotheca DAO and actually getting paid for it. Two, rewarded through ecosystem grants. There's a currently active ecosystem grant round. Loot put out a 75 ETH matching pool into the last Gitcoin round and just put out a 50 ETH matching pool into the current Gitcoin round. And I think we have like 20 or something like that, 25 grant proposals that are in the mix, spanning game dev to community management to people making a podcast, to writers, to artists, to more, who are actually getting like significant, maybe not like a year's salary, but significant money for participating. And then three is through building things yourself. And so again, one is like joining a team and actually having some incentive structure. Two is grants, and then three is building yourself. And there's a lot of value creation opportunities within the Lootverse. At any scale. Bibliotheca is at like mega scale of a whole, now multinational, metaversy, global organization. But also people are making art, making stories, making books, making hypermedia, making one-off projects. And not everything succeeds, just like anything. Not every dart thrown at the dartboard hits the bullseye. But a lot of projects have succeeded within the Lootverse, and builders and artists and developers and writers have been able to actually translate success and that feeling. I forget what word you said, Threep, but like, your ideas being welcomed and contributing and creating something of value, actually being able to capture some of that value. And so I'd say that if you're curious about this, if you're a developer, there's a lot of opportunity. But if you're not a developer, there's still lots of different places you can plug in here. If you go to gitcoin.co and just click around, you'll find the Lootverse one right on the homepage. You can click around and see what the other grants are in this current round. Or if you pop into the Discord, you can also just skim the sidebar, and there's a ton of different projects, Lootverse type projects, where each of them have their own, lack of a better word, their own monetization model. And and I don't think we should shy away from that. I think this is where I started this conversation off the bat, that Loot Year 2 is going to be about building a sustainable system. And a sustainable system creates places where people can, or creates opportunities for people to become owners of the system, either by owning some of the native tokens, like game tokens and the loot tokens and the lords tokens and whatever else, or by plugging in and building parts of the system and sort of creating their own pieces of this system. But it's a sustainable system where value is created and there's sinks and loops, and value is also extracted. And I don't think that has to be a bad word. That if somebody's creating value into an ecosystem, it's okay to extract some of that value to pay for your life and your rent and your food and your family and more. This doesn't have to be free work, but it can be a new type of work. And it's obviously not for everybody. And I agree with Loaf, like, don't quit your day job just yet. But if you're going to sit down on the couch and spend 2 hours watching Game of Thrones, come join, come try it for a couple days there, a couple of weeks, or how long is the new Game of Thrones prequel is probably 24 hours of content or something. Spend 24 hours in here building a fantasy universe with us. And I think for some people it really clicks.
So as a games investor, I talk to a lot of teams that are building really cool stuff using Web3 technologies and how they apply to games. But one of the questions I always need to ask them is, how are you getting this game or this content into people's hands? How are you reaching, 10, 100 million people with this? I'd like to ask the same question to you. Like you mentioned, okay, you're building games. These are on-chain games. They're already like on the cutting edge of the cutting edge. There's media, which is obviously like more easily approachable, more easily shareable. How are you guys thinking about bringing the loofers to millions of people?
It is funny. I mean, on this call, we do have both sides of the coin, the like media side and the game side. But yeah, go ahead with your thought.
I think at this point, like right now, like Web3 gaming itself is still so early. Like it's actually insane how and that's not just a meme. Like, I think the last I looked like 3 months ago, there was like less than 1 million wallets that had actually interacted with Web3 games, which is tiny. Like 76 million people played Clash of Clans like yesterday. And so this space is like just so much room to grow. But yeah, as you said, like how do we reach people? Right now, I'm like, my core focus is like building this game and like building the tech that will enable 1 million people to play. And I don't think even blockchain is there yet to have that amount of throughput. I think in about a year it will, but it's not even there yet. So I'm more focused on like building this high quality game, and I know the people will come. And maybe some of that $200 million that just got invested will bring a massive cohort. At this point, it's not a zero sum to anyone working in this industry. Like we're all there's so much growth to have. So much growth to go. But yeah, the question still becomes, how do you convince people this is going to be fun? How do you convince people that NFTs aren't a scam? I think we all have a bit of a hill to climb on that right now, but
I think we're also going to have to start, one of the things we're finding as we build out the Realms game and as we're thinking about kind of the next steps. Originally, I think the idea here was that we would build out the Realms game, which was for Realms holders. Imagine them being kind of royalty within the game. Then you have adventurers, who are people who you don't necessarily have to own a realm to play. So we're thinking about how do we expand to a broader audience. What we're realizing in the process is that some of the core things that just exist in typical game dev or traditional game dev do not exist in our world. As an example, there are no push notifications triggered by the blockchain today. Push notice being like a high re-engagement channel. There is no acquisition channel you can tap into because you can't put a blockchain game currently in the Apple App Store, because Apple will block you and will charge you a 30% tariff every time you want to make any transactions with your NFTs or in-game purchases. So I think there's like a series of hurdles. It's almost like the building blocks of a backend server are there in the form of the blockchain. We have a very simple identity system with your wallet that you connect, and that's about all we got so far. And so we've had to build everything else from scratch. So I think it's going to be a long time before we can hit those million user audiences. I would love to be proven wrong. To me, the question we need to ask today is, how do we get 100 people to fall in love with this game? And if we can make that happen, I'm very confident we can get the next 100 and the next 100, and we could start to solve some of those questions, like how do we re-engage people and get them to come back to this game over and over again every week? And so from my background, I think that's the real question we have to answer, is like, how do we find our super fans? How do we get 100 people? Then how do we get 1,000 people? Then how do we get 10,000? And at that point, with the economics of blockchain games, I actually think you could have a profitable game. I don't think you need 1 million users doing free-to-play mechanics. I think you can capture a lot of value with your protocol fees, your marketplace fees, et cetera. And so to me, that's the North Star today, is like, can we get 10,000 people or even 1,000 people playing this game over and over and over again? Until that happens, I don't think we have anything near a potential long-term hit on our hands.
Mm-hmm. And Tim, how do you look at this from the more the media and the storytelling side?
Yeah, I think it's two sides of the same coin. I think that a game world benefits from stories. I think stories benefit from games, and I think it's a virtuous cycle between the two. And so in this universe, I think the entry point for a lot of people may not actually be like seeing something about a game and going to the website and grabbing a character and diving in. The entry point may be more like a story or a shared clip of a video, or hell, maybe a movie in theaters. I mean, that's a big stretch, but some sort of media that maybe is less immediately demanding that you dive into it and build it together or participate in it, but you can sort of use your existing behavior, which is like just watching or just reading or just skimming. But you see it and you say, that's interesting. That's good. That's surprising. I like that character. I like what's happening here. I want a little bit more of this. And as you dive into it, you realize like, okay, wait, this runs deep, and this runs deep in a direction that I've never thought of before. It's not like, I just watched the Game of Thrones series or season 1, and wait, there's 6 seasons of this, and there's a prequel, and there's a game, and there's more. Now it's like, wait, this is interesting. I can dive into here and participate in this. Or I can dive into this and not just play a game, but also help build this game world. Or I can dive into this and grab a character and make a character and introduce my character into the lore. And so I think it's still TBD as to how collaborative media takes shape. And there surely will be all sorts of fits and starts and flops. But I think a little bit of storytelling goes a long way. And so that's what I've been focused on here, both like at the meta level, trying to help bring us together and find our shared language and give us shared spaces to feel like we're contributing together and to feel that magnetic energy. But also in particular, I've been spending a ton of time this year kind of experimenting at the edges of on-chain media and collaborative world building and community-driven canon and expansions of characters and conflicts and the way they can all fit together. I don't want to dive too much into the thing that we just launched, but we did just launch something last week in this spirit that I've been working on for a long time that was a really galvanizing moment. And maybe I'll just end by saying one very particular example of this is that last week we just launched if you will, an e-reader for the Lootverse, like an NFT device that contains a bunch of on-chain stories created by professional, semi-professional, amateur writers, and everything in between, from the community, for the community, owned by the community. And we launched it as an NFT, sold it like you do with NFTs. It brought in 200 ETH of like mint fees on day one. And we turned around and said, hey, let's take 100 ETH, which is in the scheme of like venture-backed companies, small, but in the scheme of building your own universe, significant. Let's take 100 ETH and let's donate it back to the Lootverse and back to writing grants and back to media grants, so that anybody who's curious here and wants to participate can get a storytelling grant, if you will. And so now there's an untapped pool. This is now like, 7 days old or 10 days old, an untapped pool of 100 ETH. There's a lot going on in the Lootverse, but one corner of it has this 100 ETH pool to say storytellers are welcome, and you don't just have to do it for free. There can be a little bit of like bootstrapping and kickstarting, a little bit of fuel to get people started. And so, Loaf's comment, maybe I'm not going to be the one to write that book, but I'm hoping that I can help inspire the person and invite the person who does write that best-selling novel and maybe a little Lootverse grant can help them bridge into this universe and then be on their way to their own adventure.
And so, Timshel, what is your objective for year 2? Like, what do you want to reach by the end of this year? What do you want the situation to be for the Lootverse?
I would like to give ownership to the people who are already acting like owners in the Lootverse. That's my main goal. I think sometimes that gets missed in this universe, and that sometimes DAOs are really tricky in the sense, and liquid super teams and liquid work and all this stuff is really tricky. But to me, it's really special when you have someone act like an owner of something. Owner in the sense that, like, this is my home, like, I keep it clean. Or, like, this is our space, our community, our kibbutz, our whatever analogy you want to use, and like we take responsibility for it. There are people who are in the Lootverse acting like that already, but who don't even yet have any ownership of the things, the stuff, the artifacts, the sort of raw loot bags, if you will, of the Lootverse. So broadly speaking, I would like to create moments or even just give ownership to the people who are already acting like owners. But to do that, I mean, that sounds like a noble goal. To do that, though, there's a lot of structural thinking and strategy and infrastructural change that needs to happen. A lot of that is happening in Bibliotheca already. So I think Bibliotheca is on the right path to make this happen. But I want to also do this at the level of Loot itself, and then sort of set the precedent so that anybody else who's participating and joining and being part of this universe keeps that same ethos in their mind as they build, so that the people who join in and who participate actually can sort of earn some sort of ownership of the thing. So it's kind of broad, but that's what I'm hoping for. Hoping year 2 is the year of sort of creation of the sustainable system.
When I talk about what blockchain brings to the internet more broadly, not only games, for me it's a way to granularly disperse value to all participants that added it. And so, what you describe is this universe, and everyone that brings a small piece to this universe, will get a relative, or like will capture a part of the value that was added by their piece. And, blockchain technologies is almost built to do that. So, totally get that. Threep, what is your objective over the next 12 months? What do you want to achieve, and what do you want the Lootverse to be?
I think my objective is more on the figuring out what's possible on the blockchain side of things. I think that for me, I'm very confident that we can find a way to take the value that flows in and reward it. I think that the blockchain does to finance what the internet did to content. And so I think it's inevitable that we'll find ways to take the small chunks of coins or tokens, et cetera, and figure out ways to divvy them up among the people adding the most value. What I don't know if is inevitable is whether this shared distributed computing platform can support and be a full game server for a compelling game, or for a virtual world, or for a place we want to hang out. And so what I'm really interested in exploring is, can we take the typical architecture that you see in real-time experiences, where you have a set of components and you have a set of systems, and they are tied together very loosely and composed together. Can we build that on chain in a way that other contracts can become modular pieces? Historically, if you look at how games are made, typically there's a big company, they hire a bunch of developers, they build their engine over a period of years, and then they crank out a bunch of content using that engine. And then maybe they ship a sequel, maybe they iterate and launch an expansion, et cetera. But that's kind of how the game industry works. And I'm very excited to see, can we take those same core programming constructs, can we put them on chain, and can we then see if myself building and launching my own game, can someone else come and plug their contract into that game and have it all just work together seamlessly? Because if that can happen, then you have all of the beauty of blockchain from the financial perspective of capturing and distributing value. I thought you summed it up very well, Nico. You can couple that with users who can add value at the contract level, if they're a developer, at the art level, if they're an artist, at the story level and the lore level, if they're a writer, and we will have vehicles by which they will have ways to plug in to these on-chain games. If we can give just a small version of that running, where we have an entity component system running on chain, we have a game client that syncs up with it, and then one or two other groups come in and plug in a contract, plug in some art, et cetera, and we can pull that off, then I think we're going to see an explosion of the type of explosion we saw in the open source world in the late 90s, early 2000s, and mid 2000s happening in the on-chain game, virtual world, and virtual experience space.
It's really fascinating. A few months ago, I had a conversation with Justin, who is one of the ZeroXSpark leaders. Threep, are you familiar with what ZeroXSpark is building?
I would say, like, I watch what they do. I think I understand what they're doing, but I've never spoken to them. I'm a big admirer of what they're trying to do on chain.
Yeah. Well, amongst others, I think Lattice is one of the projects within the ZeroXSpark ecosystem that is, I think, trying to solve exactly what Threep you were just describing. So, it's still an open question, but there are some very bright minds that work to solve it. Loaf, what is you already touched a bit upon, like what you're looking to do, but in a year, what do you want to have achieved with Realms?
Well, Threep's been showing me some of his early prototypes of what he's just described, so I'm going to help him realize that, and hopefully incorporate some of that conceptual work into what we're building. I think by the end of this year, in a year from now, not the end of this year, a year from now, the core Eternum game will be live at least for 6 to 9 months. People will be playing it, and people will be governing it outside of the core team, and so it'll be its self-autonomous Eternal game running. I think we're going to realize that vision within the next 3 to 6 months, and so that's the number one thing to achieve. We are going to achieve, and the other thing will be the Adventurers module, which we touched on briefly. I can't remember how deeply we got into it, but it's really this. It's a free to play, almost free to play version of this on-chain world. I think the problem the problem with a lot of the Web3 games is I'm not a believer in selling an avatar, having a constrained supply on an avatar that you use within a game. I want to make the avatar basically free to claim, and value accrue in other ways to how much you play the game. And so this whole adventurer module that we're bringing out will be free to play, almost free to play. We'd have to stop the bots, but it'll be almost free to play. And I hope to scale that to thousands of people playing, which will hopefully be using this entity system that Threep just described. We're heads down. We're still and just touching on what Threep. I believe that we can have a very immersive, highly scalable shared computer. And I think we can do it using Starks. In my mind, I like compressed computation. And, once we get to recursive proofs, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole now, but I think we can hit hyperscale and this type of, fully on-chain world that we all want to see. But we're not there yet. But I definitely believe it's possible. So yeah. The main Eternum game running, and our adventure module pumping as well, with thousands of people playing. So probably a lot of other stuff as well, but we probably haven't come up with that stuff yet.
The trio of answers to this question is just the beautiful chaos of loot in a nutshell, that we're all working towards the same goal. We talk to each other all the time, in some ways working all on the same team, yet we have 3 visions for loot that all reinforce each other. I want to have a book in my hands that I can read. Loaf wants a playable game. Threep wants a world computer and composable contracts and more. But they all play into each other, and they all are components and building blocks of a much larger thing. But yeah, the controlled schizophrenia, or whatever you want to call it, of that is a perfect little metaphor for the amazing insanity of the Lootverse.
Controlled schizophrenia. I'm going to remember that. If people get inspired by this, whatever they do, whatever they like doing, where will be the best place to get started?
Bibliotheca DAO or Discord or the Loot Discord or the Crypts and Cavern Discord. That's probably the best place to start. It's also, I mean, if you want to dive into the Loot lore, there's Loot.Foundation, which gives you the backstory if you have no idea about what Loot is. But I mean, if you're a developer, Bibliotheca DAO is probably the most active part of the Lootverse right now in terms of like developer. Like if you're curious about Starknet or building on-chain games or anything to do with that, then pop into our Discord and you can chat to me directly. I'm happy to help.
Fantastic. Got it. All right. So I get to speak to a lot of teams who are trying to use Web3 technology to build new experiences, to build new games. And I sometimes get frustrated because it feels like they're not using it enough. And it's very skeuomorphic. It's like, I'm building this game, but then our assets are NFTs. And so conversations with three of you are very refreshing because, what you guys do is so degen, is so out there, and I absolutely love it. And I hope I'm not alone, and that some of the people listening also enjoy hearing this and maybe want to help out. So Loaf, Timshel, and Threepwave, this has been fantastic as usual. I love talking with you guys about what's happening on the weird side of the internet. This has been a pleasure. So thank you for joining me. And then listeners, or listener, if you enjoyed this, please let us know. Also, last week I did a call out. As some of you know, I will be stepping down as host of the Metacast, and we're still looking for one or two other hosts to take over. So, if you could see yourself asking these on-chain legends questions and getting some of the knowledge that's in their head on this podcast, then feel free to reach out to metacast@naavik.co, and we can have a chat and see if there's a fit there. So with that, that concludes the episode. I really enjoyed this. And I look forward to speaking to you next week. Ciao.